Okay, just do the pin over here. Okay, thank you for joining me again. It's been a few weeks since we last learned together. We're still doing Masechet Yuma. We haven't finished it yet. We're only on page 9b. We're on Tet Talmud base, not far away from the top of the page. So we're really only making our entry into Yuma. You remember that Yuma deals with the halachot of Yom HaKippurim. Yuma means the day, the special day, which is an allusion to the day of Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. And the parak started with a description of the routine that the Kohen Gadol had to go through. If you remember, he needed to be separated from his home and sequestered in a chamber in the Beis Hamikdash for 7 days before the day of Yom Kippur, both to keep him tahor and also to instruct him as to how he would carry out the ceremony, which is very complicated. But the Gemara also found many allusions in the Chumash and Remazim that the Kohen Gadol, before the great occasion, has to spend 7 days in prior isolation. We brought various texts from which it could be derived that the Kohen Gadol would need 7 days of preparation and of isolation before the day he comes into the Kodesh Kodashim. So that was the subject. We went through a lot of the detail behind it, the origins, even the locations of the various chambers. And in the discussion of the Kohen Gadol, the Gemara broadened out to the Kohanim Gedolim in general on a historical basis during the first and second Beis Hamikdash. And it bemoaned the fact that in the first Beis Hamikdash, there had been very few Kohanim Gedolim because they lasted a long time in their jobs and they were carrying out their functions faithfully. In contrast, during Mikdash Sheni, there were hundreds of Kohanim Gedolim within a fairly short period of time, with each having a tenure of an average of less than a year. And that was due to two reasons. One was that they were unworthy, and some of them didn't complete their job simply because they weren't worthy of entering into the divine presence. And so they met an end, so to speak, miso midei shamayim. And the other more pragmatic, down-to-earth reason was that with the corruption during Bais Sheni, people were buying the role of Kohen Gadol. And you bought it maybe only for a few months before maybe somebody else paid a higher price. Meanwhile, you were the most revered individual in Israel. It gave you a lot of status and kudos. And even if you didn't carry out your job faithfully, you probably felt that it lifted you. From now on, you would get a chairmanship in a big enterprise. You'd be a non-exec vice president or something because you've done your job as Kohen Gadol. So the rotation took place, unfortunately, due to corruption so often that there were a large number of Kohanim Gedolim during the second Beis Hamikdash period. In discussing the inadequacies, if you like, of the Kahuna Gedola, the Gemara then, if I'm giving you the direction of travel of the last 9 daf, the Gemara moved into discussing the reasons for the destruction of the various Botei Mikdash, which was largely due to the way in which Klal Yisrael and even the Kohanim Gedolim were performing the services. And in last week, or the last week we learned together, we discussed the reasons for the destruction of the very first Beis Hamikdash, which is not the first Beis Hamikdash, but the Mishkan at Shiloh, which lasted for over 300 years, and almost as long as Bais Rishon and Bais Sheni. It's not a Mishkan to be ignored. There were a couple of other brief periods of the Mishkan where they were only there for a few decades, but in Shiloh it was there for 360-something years, I believe, before being destroyed by the Pelishtim. And during that period, we had Eli HaKohen and his sons, and various other high priests. And there was Aliyah L'Regel. There was, to a, if you like, a pale extent, some of the ritual that are associated with the first Beis Hamikdash and the second Beis Hamikdash, in its precursor state, was already there in the smaller Mishkan structure at Shiloh. And the Gemara asked the question, why was this Mishkan destroyed, Shiloh? And it answered, well, I mean, you could put it down to political happenings with the wars between the tribes and the Pelishtim. I mean, that was the cause at the human level, but on the spiritual level, that it had become corrupted, even the Mishkan at Shiloh. And this was not due to Eli, but Eli's sons. And we went through a little period of Gemara which discussed their sins, that they had perhaps exploited their role as Kohen Gedolim in dealing with the women who used to come to bring their offerings after childbirth, and they may have demanded relationship with these women, and they were out of control, or that they were deliberately delaying the korbanos they were receiving, and therefore requiring the women to remain in Shiloh longer than they should have been. They should be able to go back home to their husbands. The Gemara gave various reasons, as if you like, the hard reason and the soft interpretation of the reason. And there was corruption. And indeed, it seems that people stopped coming to Aliyah L'Regel. It was recognized. It's not something that was taking place and it was unknown to Klal Yisrael. There was corruption. And that root corruption, says the Talmud, was the reason for the destruction of Shiloh. So having dealt with that, we are now going to go on to one of the most famous Gemaras in Shas, which is essentially a continuation, but into the first Beis Hamikdash and the second Beis Hamikdash. Shiloh has been destroyed, and we've been given the reasons for it. The Brisa, of the same person who discussed for us the reasons behind the destruction of Shiloh, Rabbi Yochanan ben Turosa, goes on to give the root causes for the destruction of Bayis Rishon in Yerushalayim and Bayis Sheni in Yerushalayim. So let's now take up this Gemara on Daf Tet Amud Beis 9b, and we're starting conveniently on the first wide line. So you see the lines widen towards the right, and the first word on that line is Neatzu. It's about 10 lines or so down the page. After the two dots, Mikdash Rishon towards the middle of the line, Mipnei Mai Chorav. So the Brisa asks, if you like, the question which it's about to answer: for what reason was the first Beis Hamikdash destroyed? We're getting here to what we think is Aleph Beis for us. We know Beis Rishon was destroyed for these causes, Bayis Sheni for these causes, but the source Gemara is here on Daf Tes Amud Beis. Otherwise, we would not be familiar with these causes. So the Brisa itself answers, Mipnei Shlosha Devorim Shahayu Bo, because of the three transgressions that were rampant at the time: Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Ushfichas Damim, idol worship, immorality, and bloodshed. And we know these are the three biggies. A person doesn't have to give up his life to observe any mitzvahs in the Torah other than these three. These three, the big three of idol worship, not having immoral relations, and bloodshed. For those, a person should die rather than committing them. So if one is held at gunpoint, one should rather receive the bullet than carry out these averot. Whereas for everything else, we know that the fulfillment of a mitzvah is dochen, the situation, nitchen, the situation of pikuach nefesh, where there's a risk to life. The sustainment of life takes the priority, but not in these three. Because they were so major, and because they were rampant at the time of Mikdash Rishon, eventually that Mikdash lost its rights to continue to exist. Clearly, if you like, a Kodesh Baruch Hu is a savlan, he has patience, and he hangs on. But after a certain point in time, when the direction of travel is not reversed, and in fact it becomes a slippery slope to further destructive behaviors, the end is taken for these for the Beis Hamikdash, and this is the reason for the destruction of Bayis Rishon. And the Gemara now, rather than just saying, well, isn't it obvious, is going to bring you verses in Tanakh to prove that these averos, these transgressions, were in fact in place during Bais Rishon period, in case you don't believe it. Avodah Zarah, how do we know that there was idol worship at the time of Bais Rishon? And here we have the Gemara, the Brisa, bringing a verse, an extract, and it's from Sefer Yeshayahu, Isaiah. Tichsiv, first one, let's just read the verse. As usual, the drush in the Brisa here is going to be somewhat more subtle than the simple translation of the words. If you were to read it from the King James Edition translation, the context would lead you to come to a slightly different interpretation of the meaning than that which is going to be ascribed to it here in the Gemara. Here the Gemara is going to use it for the purposes it wishes to use it. Dichsiv ki kotza hamatzah mehistoreya v'hamasecha tzara kehiskanes. It's a delightful posuk. Let me now share my screen and I'll give you a little bit of Technicolor behind the psukim. I've forgotten how to share screen, so remind me. Share screen. This is it. Right. Yes, I'm sharing screen. Okay. I'm going to go back to some of these moments. Okay. So here is the posuk from Yeshayahu. I've written it for you with the Safaria translation. This is not the translation which will be ascribed to it by our Gemara here. Ki kotza hamatzah mistoreya v'hamasecha tzara kiskanes. So let's translate it literally, if you can translate anything literally. The couch is too short for stretching out. Have you ever complained about the couch being too short? You're a 6-footer and the couch is only 5'9", and your legs are dangling out, and the cover, the masecha here means a cover, like a screen, a blanket. The cover is tzara, too tight, too narrow, kehis kanes, for bringing your feet in together. Even when you try and curl up under the blanket, your toes are still sticking out. A delightful posuk. What does it actually mean? Well, if you look in the Tanakh, all the commentators, when trying to put it within the context of the Tanakh, reading it as a narrative, this is referring to the prophecy of the invasion by the Assyrians, from Ashur, who are going to take away the 10 tribes. And what it means to say is when they march the armies in, the landscape will be so covered like ants and locusts by the Assyrian army that there will be almost no, if you like, land visible because of the large numbers of troops taking it over. The couch will be too short to stretch out. You won't even be able to stretch out your feet without knocking over an Assyrian soldier, if you like. And the cover too narrow for curling up. That seems to be the context. But the Brisa here clearly is not going to use it that way. Because remember, the Brisa here wants to use this as evidence that there was a Avodah Zarah, that there was idol worship. Where do we see a hint to idol worship in this posuk? It is only to do with couches and covers. So now let's learn how beautifully the Brisa reads this posuk. So I'm going to quit sharing for a moment, so you can go back if you are looking in the Gemara and focus on the Gemara. My, says the Brisa, how shall we read and interpret these words? The couch is too short to stretch out. Matzah, by the way, can mean a mattress. The mattress is too short to stretch out. So Amar Rabbi Yonasan, so Rabbi Yonasan says this is how you should read the verse for the reasons that we want to read the verse. Kotzah matzah zeh. This couch, if you like, which we're going to say now refers to the Beis Hamikdash, a place in which you might recline from time to time, not in order to have a good time, but in order to worship, let's say. Right? We're taking this way out of context. This is a drasha. This Beis Hamikdash now is too tight. This is the way the Brisa sees it. Let's change the word historea to historer. It's a word that appears in Parshas Korach, which means in order to rule over, from the word sar, a prince, in order to rule over. This Beis Hamikdash does not have enough room for 2 leaders to rule over. That's a new interpretation. This matzah, the Beis Hamikdash, where we recline, does not have enough room for two leaders to be the managers of. In other words, there's only enough room for one manager. And who's the manager of Beis Hamikdash? Should be HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As if to say that the Pasuk is an allusion to the fact HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying that Klal Yisrael, in being over Avodah Zorah, are trying to bring another God into their house, another ruler into our house. But hang on, there's only enough room for one of us here, and that's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When you try and bring idols in, when you bring Avodah Zorah in, you're trying to bring another partner in to the leadership, and there isn't enough room for both of us. We can't both stretch out on the same mattress. One of them has to be kicked out. If Avodah Zorah kicks out Hashem, it's going to destroy the Beis Hamikdash. But if the people will kick out Avodah Zorah, Hashem will reign supreme, and there won't be any need to take it out on the people and on the Beis Hamikdash. So this pasuk is an allusion to Avodah Zorah. Just before we go any further, we'll see this and another pasuk to come. We will be using allusions, psukim which are not directly reflecting the Aveira we're discussing. We're here discussing Avodah Zorah. You could put a pin in 1,000 pages of Tanakh and find explicit reference to Avodah Zorah, to Pesalon, to idols, to Baal, to all sorts of nasty forms of worship that took place, which are absolutely explicit. Over here, it seems that Brisa is resorting to subtle interpretation of a verse and taking completely out of context to prove there was a Avodah Zorah. I mean, what's going on over here? I can bring you 100 psukim just by turning the pages to Tanakh, which say there is a Avodah Zorah, there is a Avodah Zorah, and there's a Avodah Zorah. Why do I have to bring a pasuk that is not talking about a Avodah Zorah, which is talking about the Assyrian army, and then turning it inside out and saying that I can reinterpret this as Avodah Zorah? Why do I take the most unobvious source when there are so many obvious sources in Tanakh during the first Beis Hamikdash of unfaithfulness to HaKadosh Baruch? So the commentaries ask this, scratching their heads, you couldn't find a better example than this? Yeah, it's good fun. And we learn something from this, but this is not necessarily it's not an archetypical source. It's difficult to know what the answer is. So the answer given by some of the commentators is if over here, the Brisa is fully aware. It could have taken any explicit source that there was a Avodah Zorah, as it will be able to in a moment, as far as Gilui Harois, immorality as well, plenty of psukim that talk about immoral behaviors, but it's going to take psukim which are subtle and which are not direct and not explicit. And maybe there are two reasons. One is that you get more, when you in the Shir group get more schar by learning with me an interpretation of Chazal than you would do if I took you straight to a pasuk that said, how do we know there's a Avodah Zorah? Because the pasuk says in Yeshayahu, you're all worshipping strange gods. Well, I mean, okay, it would take you 1 minute to listen to this, and it would be a very obvious interpretation. You could have got that interpretation from the King James Bible or the Hebrew Publishing or whatever it was, and that wouldn't really be learning Torah. However, by learning it from the subtle cases, we've had to bring the sage's interpretation of a pasuk and their subtle droshes. You're learning Torah to a deeper extent. I mean, that is, if you like, that's an answer. It's an answer that, in fact, it is good for us to learn a Torah in greater depth by trying to bring it out from the below the surface rather than taking above the surface pasuk, which is more obvious. Another reason may be simply that over here, maybe the Gemara doesn't want to be too direct. Rather than bringing a pasuk that says you committed Avodah Zorah, which makes us all squirm, it brings a pasuk which isn't so obviously about Avodah Zorah and saying, it's a subtle hint. We'll rather bring subtle criticism than a frontal criticism assault, really. And that may be another reason we're bringing a pasuk which we have to work so hard to extract this message from. Let's just go on. Remember the second part of this pasuk, which seems to say much the same, that the cover, the blanket, if you like, is too short to be able to, that you can't even curl up in it. That's very much, it sounds a little bit as a repeat of the first part, that the couch is too short to stretch out. The blanket is too short to you can't even curl up in. So here, it does mean roughly the same. It's obviously a repeat of the same message. Again, don't try and cover yourself with two gods. We don't believe in this idea that you can practice voodoo and at the same time you can be a Catholic like they do in South America. You've got to decide, which chasana you want to dance on. If you are for Baal, you're for Baal. If you're a Kadosh Baruch Hu, Kadosh Baruch Hu. One of them has to be eliminated. So, but over here, the Brisa goes on, or the Gemara goes on. Omer Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani, he said about this part of the posuk, and by the way, the word kehiskanes is a big problem. It should be mehiskanes or lehiskanes, but let's just leave out the ka, which means like bringing your feet in together, like curling up. Very strange. Anyway, he says, Himoti Rabbi Yonasan lahaikra Bachi. When Rabbi Yonasan arrived at this posuk, if you like, when he learned this verse, he used to cry every time he did chazara on this verse. What verse? That the hamasecha tzara kehiskanes. Then he burst into tears. Why would he burst into tears just to hear this subsection of a posuk? Why? And this is the reason. This is the reason he gave. Mam dichsiv kones kaneid mehayom. And the meaning of this isn't very clear in the context. I've read some interpretations, it could take a long time explaining them, from the Ein Yaakov. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it says about HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Tehillim, that he gathers together like as if in a bottle all the waters of the sea. And this may be a reference to Kriyas Yamsuf when the waters are parted. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, can see the whole colossal Pacific and Atlantic Ocean. And if he wanted to, he could cram them all together into a single jug, if you want. This is an idea of HaKadosh Baruch's koach over teva, if you like. Nasis lo masechet tzara? Question. All of a sudden, HaKadosh Baruch Hu finds it too difficult to be able to accommodate some other deity. In other words, you can see HaKadosh Baruch Hu's strength seems to be limited. He can do anything, but it seems the only thing he was not prepared to do is to live, so to speak, with an adulterous partner. And Klal Yisrael are his partner, so to speak. And if Klal Yisrael are adulterous, they take Baal or they take some other gods into their bed with him. He can't. He's not able to withstand the pressures of sharing Klal Yisrael with anyone else, even though he's able to gather all the seas together. And this brought Rabbi Yonasan to the verge of tears. Okay, very nice little Agadah, again showing how seriously the Chachamim took psukim like this and how it affected them really to their very depths of their hearts. Okay, so the Brisa, this is a very long Brisa, has explained how we know that during Churban Bais Rishon, there was Avodah Zarah. We brought this subtle posset to prove it. Now, we also said that a second major transgression was Gilui Royos, which means immorality, which usually means adultery. And in other words, women and men having multiple partners and not being faithful to each other, which, by the way, is a bit of a reflection and a counterpart of not being faithful to God, where you have Avodah Zorah, if you like. We had an adulterous relationship of Klal Yisrael. In a sense, they were looking, when they turned right, they were looking to Hashem, and when they turned left, they had an idol. That was an adulterous relationship. A second form of adultery, but an adultery within the flesh and not in the spirit, is Gilui Royos. How do we know there was Gilui Royos in the first Beis HaMikdash period? Once again, I could point you to many psukim in Tanakh that said that very clearly, that they used to, have a non-monogamous relationship, that there were terrible things going on in Klal Yisrael. But the Bryce is going to bring another posuk, which is not directly insinuating that there was Gilui Royos, but from which we can interpret that was the meaning. And I'm going to share the screen with you. It's a delightful posuk, which the women, I'm sure, will enjoy greatly in one moment. And it's over here. I've done it in Technicolor for you for a reason which is probably not yet clear, but it will be clear in a moment. And I've shown you once again the Heiliger Sefaria translation, which I think is hilarious. Anyway, let's read the pasuk first. By Yom Hashem, why are you going to be destroyed during the first Beis Hamikdash? Why is doom and destruction coming your way? And here's the answer. Ki gavhu benos Zion. Let's translate it Sefaria style. Because the daughters of Zion are so vain. Gavhu, haughty, they're so vain. By teilachna greenau, netuyos goron, and walk with heads thrown back. Okay, stretched out necks. They pull their necks up into the air in a very haughty fashion. Umasakaros einayim, not clear what that means. A lovely translation. With roving eyes. It means their eyes are doing a tour of the neighborhood, so to speak. They're looking around them. Haloch v'tofov telachna, beautiful words in Yeshaya again. And, well, I love this. And with mincing gait. If you can tell me what mincing gait means, sounds very fleishik, but it's the way they're walking. They're walking in a way in order to draw attention to themselves, if you like. Uveraglehem ta'aksana. Well, that's an impossible word to translate, so I won't even try. Making a tinkling with their feet. Isn't that cute? They're wearing their high heel shoes, and they have little metal edges on their heels, and they're making a tinkling. Why? They want to be heard. They want to draw attention to themselves. These are the haughty women of Zion. And you can already see over here, certainly, some sort of allusion to the fact that they're looking for the young lads to get involved with them. And by the way, this doesn't say anything about adultery or immoral behavior. It may not be correct behavior, but who says they're married? Maybe they are going to be monogamous. Maybe they're looking for a marriage partner. Nevertheless, these words are, in a sense, they're not words you'd use in a comfortable Jewish spiritual environment to describe Beis Yaakov girls, for example. And, if you have this description of Beis Yaakov girls, you'd throw them out if this is the way they were disporting themselves. Now let's see, though, the way in which Chazal translate it. What they do essentially is they stretch the meaning out further, even than this delightful translation of Sefaria. So let me return. Gilu Iroyas, says the Brisa, Dichsev, where do I know that there was immorality? And here's the pasuk by Yom Hashem, and Hashem said, and we're going to translate these phrase by phrase in a moment. Yan ki gavu benos Zion, by teilachna netuyos goron, exactly the verse, umesakros einayim, haloch v'tofov teilachna, uveragleihen ta'akasna. Okay, now this is the meaning, says the Brisa. Yan ki hu benos Zion. When the verse says, because we translate it, they were vain, the benos Zion. The Brisa is not going to translate it that way. Remember, we're doing a drasha. It doesn't have to translate these things the way Sefaria translated it. The Brisa wasn't even aware of Sefaria. So what was wrong with these benos Zion? It says gavhu. What does gavo I mean? Tall, high. Okay, so let's have a look at the Brisa. Shahoyu mahalchos aruka b'tzad katsora. This is actually quite cute. A tall woman, and the way I translate it anyway from here, I may be wrong, a tall woman used to walk side by side with a short woman. Why? Because the tall woman essentially wanted to say, I'm tall. So if you could find a shorter woman near you, it would exaggerate your height. And somehow the lads would be more for you if you were tall than if you were short. So ki gavhu benos Zion is taken literally. So it's crazily, really, you might say, in this translation of Brisa, because they're trying to make themselves look taller than they really are. What a strange translation. And they're doing this to attract the attention of their partners. Go on. That part, we say they went with outstretched necks, if you like. Says the Brisa, what does that mean? Shahoyu mahalchos the koma zakufa. Now that's a little bit more normal. They would go with a very upright posture. Yes, not crouched over, but with an upright posture, proud of their looks, if you like. Again, bringing attention to themselves. Umasakros einoim. Remember that the Safari translated it that their eyes were, so to speak, darting around, looking at different people. The Bryce says no. The Brisa translates this to havu malyan kuchla enehen. They used to paint their eyes with blue or with red shadow. In other words, they used to use eye makeup to exaggerate the contours of their eyes and make themselves look even more beautiful than they really were. So we're not talking about them looking around, but rather the way in which they cosmetically adorned themselves to make themselves look beautiful. And then, haloch v'tofof telachna, they would walk. I forgot what our holy, go back to the screen. How did he translate it? And with mincing gait. Okay, well, what does the Brisa say about mincing gait? Again, Brisa doesn't know anything about mincing gait. So, halak tofo telachna says the Brisa, lost the place now, excuse me. Shahoyu mahalchos okev b'tzad godel. They used to walk with very small steps. And the word is actually tofof. In halacha sometimes means tight, something very tight. What they would do, says Rashi, the way he translates it, is they would walk, if they put their left foot down, they would then move their right foot directly in front of the left foot. So the heel of their right foot was touching the toe. And then they would move the left foot. So they would move in these as if they were measuring the length of a room by footsteps. Why would they do that? Because they would be able to walk more slowly. And why would they walk more slowly? Because they wanted the lads to spend more time looking at them. In other words, they were flirts. If you walk fast, then the boys wouldn't have enough time for you to attract their attention. However, if you walk slowly, this is what means holach v'tofot telachna. They more moved in very small steps. Okay. Then uveraglehem ta'akasna, where the Safaria talks here about tinkling with their feet. Very interesting pshat. I just stop sharing. So here the Brisa says, okay, Shahayu Rabbi Yitzchok, Shahayu Mevias more over parsimon. They would take fragrance and perfumes, umanichas b'min alehon, and they would spray foot spray. They would spray it on their shoes and on the soles of their feet. Beautiful smelling perfumes. Ukishemagios eitzel b'churei Yisrael, and when they would pass near the young lads of Israel, boatos, they would kick their legs a little bit, flip their heels, umatizos alehem, in order to spray their perfume, flip the perfume in the eyes of the surrounding lads, and they would therefore instill such a powerful yetzer hara in those men as if it were the venom of a snake, which would be impossible to withhold and to withstand. So anyway, so this is the posuk used by the Brisa to demonstrate the extent to which the women were inviting the attention of men. And this is being used as the source phrase for the Gilui Aroyos, the immorality at the time of the first Beis HaMikdash. Again, the posuk, even in translation Safari, makes those same suggestions, but they've been magnified somewhat by the way in which the Brisa has stretched each of these to cover even more impertinent behaviors. Okay. Finally, shfichos damim, bloodshed. And over here, the Brisa simply brings the most clear posuk, really. It doesn't bring any subtle references to bloodshed, and it's going to bring a posuk, dichsiv. The posuk says here in the Nevorah, the Chorban, and it's referring here to the king Manasseh, who was a terrible evil king. The Gam Dam Noki Shofach Manasseh, Harbe Ma'od, Ad Asher Milei es Yerushalayim per leper. Manasseh filled Yerushalayim with so much bloodshed that it almost stretched per leper from mouth to mouth. In other words, the streets were full of the blood of people, of victims of his. So there was innocent blood taken. And that is the case of Shvichas Damim. Okay. At this point, we finished the saga of Bayis Rishon. Why was Bayis Rishon destroyed? Because of the three cardinal sins that were transgressed. Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim. How do we know? The Brisa here brought psukim, sometimes subtle, sometimes open, that these were the sins of the time. And they're essentially the sins you find recounted by the Nevi'im. In whether you look at Yishai or Micha or Yirmiyahu, you find generally this is a common denominator of the theme of all the Nevi'im in their critique of Klal Yisrael. So now we're going on. The Brisa carries on. This is still the same Brisa which started off with Shiloh, went on to Bayis Rishon, is now going on to Bayis Sheni. Aval Mikdash Sheni, but that was Bayis Rishon. They did all these terrible things. They deserved to have the Beis HaMikdash brought down on their heads. Aval Mikdash Sheni, the second sanctuary, the second Beis HaMikdash. Shahayu Oskin B'Torah B'Mitzvos U'Gemilas Chasodim. We have a tradition that there were very fine and holy people living at the time, and they learned Torah, and they did mitzvahs and gemilas chasodim. We're not now talking about necessarily the Kohanim Gedolim, but we said that they were not very good. But the people, the Perushim, the Pharisees, the rabbis, this is a period of the time of Hillel and Shammai and of the Zugos. This is the time of the early Tanoim. This is a time where much of our Mishnah takes root. We're talking here about people closer to us today. They were Gedolim, and yet they lost the Beis HaMikdash. So what was their sin? Mipnei ma chorev. Why was Bayis Rishon destroyed? And here we have that famous answer. Mipnei shehoysa bo sinas chinam. Because they suffered from the fault of sinat chinam, which is usually translated as groundless hatred. By the way, that's not an easy concept to understand. When does some sort of dislike become groundless hatred? When is something groundless? What about groundful? Well, if you have a groundful hatred, is that all right? This is not an easy topic at all. You know, we always spout sinos chinam, but then sinos chinam comes in many flavors. We won't cover all those flavors, but let's just have a little look at what the Brisa makes of it. What does that teach you? That the Beis HaMikdash, Sheni, that we're saying there wasn't Avodah Zarah, there wasn't Gilui Arayos to the same extent, and there wasn't Shvichas Damim until right at the end. There was a lot of Shvichas Damim at the end. But for much of the period, there wasn't any of these things. The Romans may have done certain things, but the people themselves were not really tainted by those cardinal averas. What does it prove? That the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed nevertheless. Lelamedocha sheshekula sinas chinam keneged sholosh averos. Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos, Shvichas Damim. This teaches us the incredible fact, which we hear very often when it comes to the 3 weeks and you're listening to drushes, that sinas chinam, the avera of sinas chinam, and the weight of that avera is comparable to the weight of those other 3 cardinal averas, Shvichas Damim, Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayos. It's very strange. Sinas chinam may not even require any physical act. I can hate somebody in my heart and think he's not as good as me, but I could still write him a letter and I might still walk with him in the street. I'm not knocking him on the head necessarily. So how can we say such a thing? Well, obviously a lot is written on this topic, and it's not the topic for now why sinas chinam is the granddaddy. In fact, it's so serious, as we'll see later on, that we haven't even had Bayis Shlishi yet after 2,000 years, whereas the sins of Bayis Rishon, the 3 cardinal averas, seem to have been expiated in 70 years in Golus Bovel, but we don't seem to have undone the damage of sinas chinam after another 2,000 years. So it's even, you can see what a mega avera it is. And the various reasons given that sinas chinam, it's a slippery slope. When you start with sinas chinam, it always goes on to something worse. It doesn't just stop with an avera of transgressing the love in the Torah, lo sisna zachicha bilvovecha. That's the source in the Torah. You shouldn't hate your fellow man in your heart. You shouldn't be hypocritical. You should lend him a hand. It doesn't, and v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. It doesn't just end there. It goes, usually will go much further than that and lead to the dissolution of society, disunity of society, and the breakup of Klal Yisrael. So it's a mega avera. It's much more all gripping than one of the individual averas. And you could say, for example, that Gilui Averis, Gilui Royus, is sometimes you could say I was over tempted. I had a tava. There shouldn't be a tava, a lust for sinas chinam. Sinas chinam is not something you need to control in the same way as you need to control a tava. You could say almost the person is relatively innocent, even though he has committed a major avera of adultery, but he did so because he was overtaken by some sort of passion. Okay, but sinas chinam is a continuous thing. That's another thing they say. It gnaws at you forever and ever. It never goes away, and it always accumulates more and more victims. I have a feeling, a bad feeling towards you. It's reflected in a bad feeling between you and me, and then it passes through to the whole of society. It passes through to Lashon Hara, to Rechilas, to the breakdown of society, to the breakdown of law and order, and everything else that is necessary to maintain Klal Yisrael. So that is the reason that sinas chinam is considered to be so weighty. And there seems to be a lot of sinas chinam in Bayis Sheni. Remember also what, according to the Gemara and Gittin, brought about the destruction of Beis HaMikdash. What event? That was the Kamsa Bar Kamsa story. The whole thing about the wrong person being invited to the party and then embarrassing people, and the whole thing, and that was all due to the hatred that the party maker had for Kamsa, and as a result of that, that led to a whole story and chain of events to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Now, sinas chinam was the immediate, not the immediate, but the distant catalyst of Korban, according to that particular Agadah, and it's considered to have been the downfall of Bayis Sheni. Yeah, I wanted to interrupt for a moment and take you back before we go into the body of the Gemara to a few other things as well that when we looked at Mikdash Rishon, for example, and we say, why was the Beis HaMikdash destroyed? And then we said it was because of Avodah Zarah, Gilui Royas, and Shvichos Damim. This is an extract from the Gemara we learnt half an hour ago. I just wanted to bring up the fact that if you look throughout the Gemara, you find other reasons also given. There isn't only one reason. This is a famous one. There are two other reasons specifically, which don't seem to be so important, which are given for the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, whether it's the first or whether it's the second Beis HaMikdash. And it's not just sinas chinam, and it's not just for the second Beis HaMikdash and those three cardinal averas the first. We can actually find other messages in the Torah, or you can say there in the Gemara, which are contributing factors. So apart from this main one, here's another one, which is very interesting, which you think is relatively minor. Asher ya'asu zu lifnim mishuras hadin. The important thing is to go lifnim mishurat hadin, to go further than the actual law requires of you. You should go further, not just stop at the line. Sometimes, to be a good Jew, you shouldn't stop at what you must do, but you go and do what you think a Jew should do. What is the nobility of a Jew to do? So, the Omer Rabbi Yochanan, we just carry on here. Where am I? Lo chorba Yerushalayim. Why was Jerusalem destroyed? And we're not going to find sinas chinam. Ela shedonu bo din Torah, because when they made their judgments, when they paskened their halachas, when they had a din Torah, they paskened it according to the letter of the Torah law. So the Gemara asks, what's so wrong with that? They should get kudos for that, says the Gemara, for judging according to the letter of the Torah law. Isn't that ideal? Do you want them to make up the laws? Of course it should be according to Torah law. Ella Ema, what you should really say when you understand this statement of Rabbi Yochanan, shehemidu dinehem al din Torah v'lo avdu lifnim mishuras hadin. They established their rulings on the basis of Torah law and did not go beyond the letter of the law. That's an amazing statement. Yerushalayim was destroyed. You might say there was no, even had they, according to this, we don't bring up sinas chinam, we don't bring up the cardinal averas. What do we bring up? That they kept the Torah. But they kept the Torah as far as the Torah law is concerned. And we know when we read various parshas like Kedoshim, to be a full Jew, it's not enough. Just the Torah law is supposed to give us a grounding and an instinct, an intuition into what the Torah demands for us, of us. But in many situations, we have to go further than the letter of the law demands. They're minimum standards. These are minimum standards. But in dealing particularly with your fellow man, if you stop at the Torah law and don't go further, you might never be sufficiently charitable. I mean, you might say, well, I've given a penny to tzedakah. The Torah law doesn't require any more than that. So if other people are hungry, they're hungry, but I fulfilled my Torah law. And in any situation, in a situation where you have a dispute over something, if you keep to the Torah law and you don't try to compromise, or you don't try to give a little bit, it can end up being essentially in a society breaker as well. Again, the Torah law lays out minima. You're supposed to go further than that. So here we have a Gemara saying that the Yerushalayim was destroyed because society could not, if you like. Oh, no. Has it?
Well, it has for me.
Are you still there, guys? Oh, mummy.
Hi.
Is it back? Are you there? You lost me for a moment, didn't you? Okay. All right. So sometimes you've got to go further than the letter of the law. If you go only up to the letter of the law, it could end up being cold and cruel and sharp. So because they didn't do that, they deserve to lose Yerushalayim. Now, it could be that this is meant to be an exaggeration, a guzma, but it's meant to encourage people to go further than the letter of the law. And there's another, we won't spend a lot of time on this. It says, why did the Navi and the sages ask the story, the question, why did we lose the Beis HaMikdash and Yerushalayim? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav she'ein mevarchen b'Torah tchila. Extraordinary one. Well, this is from the Gemara in Nedorim, that because they didn't make a bracha before they learned Torah. Very strange. In other words, even if they learned Torah, they didn't make a bracha beforehand. So some want to say it means the critique here, which is that even when you learn Torah, if you don't learn Torah with a passion and believing that this is a God-given gift, but you're learning it in a sense intellectually, then it's not going to do anything for you. And it's a big lack in learning of Torah is not to appreciate Torah for what it really is. There are many interpretations given to that. I just wanted to bring you some of these other dimensions. But over here, this famous brisa ascribes the sinas chinam to the second Beis HaMikdash as the cause, and the three cardinal averas for the first Beis HaMikdash. When we're looking at the Bai Sheni and sinas chinam, I just wanted to learn with you. It's a famous nitziv, which you always learn whenever you learn this topic. He talks about Bai Sheni period. We're being very critical here and saying during Bai Sheni, look at what it said over here about it in the Brisa. Hayu oskin ba Torah over mitzvahs of the midas chasadim. What, this sounds like we're in the age of the Mashiach. But the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed and there was a golus because of sinas chinam. So how can you tie up the two? How can this be consistent or compatible? A society which is so steeped in Torah and mitzvahs and midas chasadim, but we say that's sinas chinam. So we have over here a very famous Hakdama of the Nitziv to Sefer Bereshis. And it's a Hakdama to his Pirish on the Torah, Ha'emek Doba. So I haven't got a translation here for you. Let's just do it. It's not that long. It's much longer than it really is, but in fact, it's quite an easy one. Va'inyan. And he's actually bringing this as a hypodermic to Sefer Bereshis. Why is that? Because Sefer Bereshis was called by Chazal Sefer HaYashar. Interesting. This is the name given by Chazal as an overall description for Sefer Bereshis. It's the book of the upright, Sefer HaYashar. And who are the upright? The Avot. That the Avot were upright. As if to say that many other generations are not upright, but the Avot were upright. So it's Sefer HaYashar. So he explains, V'ha'inyan, T'nisba, I'm on the first line, sorry. T'nisba b'shiras ha'azinu al apostle katzor tomim pa'lo, tzadik v'yashahu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tzadik v'yashu. The Shavach Yashar, what does it mean? What does the praise Yashar mean? Sefer Yashar, but the Avos were Yashar, who ne'ema lahatzdik din HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chorban b'yasheni. In Hazinu, we already have an allusion to the fact that a temple will once, in the future, be destroyed because the people were not Yashar. And that's an allusion to Ba'asheni, says in Itziv. It says furthermore, it says in the Hazinu poem, that they were a generation, Ba'asheni generation, where they did mitzvahs and benes chassav, they were twisted. It's not incredible. It sounds as though we're dealing here with Jekyll and Hyde characters, great people, but at the same time, in some words, completely corrupted. Upirashna, we explain tzadikim v'chasidim v'amlei Torah, even though they were tzadikim, chasidim, and Torah learners, ach lo hayu yesharim b'halichos olamim. But in their day-to-day practices in the world, they were not upright. They were spiritually upright, and even in terms of chesed, but they were not upright in their dealings. How could that be? Because they held from one to the other a dose of sinat chinom, it could be jealousy or simply antagonism one to the other without good cause. What does that mean? Choshtu esmi she'ra'u she'noheg she'lo kadatom. Very, very common today. That everyone suspected anybody else who didn't behave entirely along their derech, the Yiras Hashem, Shehud Seduki V'Apikoros. You know, anyone to the left of me is a Seduki and Apikoros. Yes, anyone to the right of me is Meshubah Frum. This idea was already there amongst the noble, learned folk and sages at the time of the Ba'ashenu. Eventually, this leads to Shindale, to Shvichas Domim, to bloodshed. B'derech hafloga, because of the division it brings. And to all the evil in the world. It was a slippery slope. When you just carry a little dose of sinas chinim in your heart, and if you can, so to speak, corral it so it doesn't actually grow, you could say it's human nature. Everybody's a bit envious of someone else and thinks the other person didn't quite like him. But it never stops at that. And what happens is it exploded at the time of Ba'asheni. But it started off from sinas chilam b'libon. And in Ha'azino, essentially, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is saying this is the reason that Ba'asheni will be destroyed because they were not Yashar. HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yashahu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu by definition is Yashar. And Yashar means upright. And that means you don't hold any taint of sinat chinam in your heart or any antagonism against your fellow man. For Eino Sovel, Tzadikim ke'elu. Very strong words of Nitziv. Nitziv was a great moralist, and he was very straightforward and very critical of hypocrisy. He could not stand hypocrisy. He says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu cannot tolerate tzadikim like these. These sort of tzaddik HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want, who always thinks everybody else is a Rasha except him, or isn't going as far to the left or to the right. HaKadosh Baruch Hu only wants people who walk straightly and are honest and sincere and not hypocritical. Gam b'halichos olam, even in their day-to-day worldly activities, not just in the way you learn or you don't learn. The lo ba'akmimus, not to go in crookedness. Afalgav shehu l'shem shamayim. Even if you think your crookedness is l'shem shamayim. In other words, you have all these great people during the Bayis Sheni period, and they think that their antagonism against another group that isn't just like them is l'shem shamayim. Look, if I'm not antagonistic to these people might start taking over society, or maybe my child will be going off the derech because he'll mix with the wrong people, or whatever it is. And you begin to think like that, and everyone believes that their extremism is l'shem shamayim. It's a definition of an extremist, a religious extremist, that he believes it's l'shem shamayim. But the Nitziv says this is not considered, you're not considered to be a tzaddik if you do this. There's a gorem churban habaria that leads to the destruction of the creation for harisas yishuv oretz and the breakup of the yishuv in Eretz Yisrael. And why do we relate to the others as being Yashar? I mean, we've received here the necessary mussar on the a lack of the uprightness at the time of Bayis Sheni. But what about the others? So he says, this was the praise of the others that were Yeshar. Apart from the fact that they were Chasidim and Tzadikim over Hashem, they were also upright. It's very clear that it says here as the currency or the proof of being a yashar and upright is how you deal with your fellow human beings. It's not just how you deal with your fellow Jew. It's how you feel. That really is the stamp of your character, even with Umos HaOlam. And don't forget, everyone at the time of the office was really an Umos HaOlam. There was no real Jewish people at the time. So they were dealing with all sorts of idolatrous guys around them. Afilu of the Elilim Mechorim, even despicable of the Elilim, they were courteous to. Mikol Mokem Hayu Imam Ba'ava, V'choshen Tuvosam, they loved them and they were concerned about the welfare of their fellow man, Ba'ashehi Kiyum Habriya, because this is a necessary requirement for sustaining the creation. Kamosha Onu Ron Kama Hishtateach Abraham Avinu Aleph and Hispalel al Sodom. Why did Abraham Avinu pray as he did in a chutzpahdik fashion for the survival of Sodom, these evildoers? Afalgav Shahayo Saneosom, whereas Malcolm Tachle Sinner, even though he hated everything they did, Avur Rishasom, Kamavur Bamamra Lamelach Stone, Mikomokam Chofetz Bikiyomom, he wished them to continue to be part of mankind. Uber Rabbi mentions a parsha of Bereishis Rabbah about which praises Abraham for it. And that's why he was called Av Hamon Goyim. He saw everybody, he was like the father of humanity. He was a Yashar, and he didn't hate people, if you like, because they were different. Even though here we're talking about different to the extreme of difference. We're talking about small differences in groups within Klal Yisrael, but even those evildoers. And he goes and he brings, I won't go any further on this, but he brings further examples. I mean, you see also the way Abraham negotiated for Machpelah, in the way he held himself down and he respected the people negotiating with him, even though they cheated. You see how Yaakov mourned the way in which Shem had been dealt with by his sons, etc. We see many examples in dialogues in the Sefer Bereshis that the others dealt kindly, well. They made brisim, etc., with those around them, and that they were yashar. This is the idea. He also quotes in Netziv the way Yaakov was respectful towards Lavan for so long, despite everything, all the exploitations for 30 years or whatever it was, 20 years, that Lavan exploited him until he finally ran away after Yosef was born. That the others were yasharim, and that's why Bereshis is Sefer HaYashar. And yashrus is a very important ingredient that was missing during Bayis Rishon. This is an Netziv, and he claims that this is sufficient reason for the destruction of Bayis Sheni. So we'll stop over here. You can unmute yourself. I'll just stop the recording if I can find where.